Inflation nation, the struggle for some Canadians to keep up with rising food and housing costs.
Let's recap 2024.
What happened in Canada, how it affected Canada's immigration policy, new rules, and discuss what to expect next year.
The strength of the Canadian dollar has slipped to its lowest level in 5 years.
And inflation made everyday groceries feel like luxury items, forcing nearly 2 million Canadians to start using food banks.
Meanwhile, the housing crisis deepened.
The majority of Canadians are concerned the national housing crisis is affecting their health and quality of life.
Homeownership rates, once a point of pride of Canadians, dropped below 66%. That's down from 69% at its peak just a decade ago.
For younger Canadians, it got even worse. Less than 40% of those under 35 could afford a home. This number fueled frustration and despair, especially in major cities where the dream of owning a home has become completely out of reach. You would have to make over $300,000 a year as a household just to qualify for buying a home.
This economic squeeze set the stage for growing public outrage.
We are here today because Canada is broken. Our kindness and generosity has given way to naivety and weakness. We did not want to be taken advantage of, tricked, lied to, and sold out by those we trusted to lead us.
Housing costs have doubled, food bank use have doubled.
Fueled by the opposition party, immigration got in the spotlight as the first thing to blame for all the Canada's problems.
Well, immigration and the current government.
Housing prices?
Immigration's fault.
Overburdened healthcare?
Immigration's fault.
Canada's broken?
Trudeau's fault.
You get the point. For the first time in decades, Canadians have turned against immigration. Polls showed that over 60% of Canadians thought that we were taking in too many immigrants, and that's in the country known for its welcoming policies to immigration.
So let's talk about Canada's immigration.
This is the number of immigrants annually since the 2000s. The numbers typically held under 300,000 and started going up just 2 years before the pandemic. And then the pandemic happened, but then it picked up again, and a lot more aggressively.
You see that in 2023, Canada admitted a record 471,000 new permanent residents, accounting for 1.2% of the total population. Now that's just the part of the story, because if we look at the real population growth, it was more like 1 million people last year.
So who are the other 600K of people?
Good question. That's where a thing got out of control. You see, there are different ways for countries to fight recession, and recession risk was what Canada was facing, just like every other country after the pandemic. We're not economists, so we won't pretend to be ones, so we'll only share what makes sense to us and likely most of you. Nearly 3.5 million Canadians lost jobs, retirements increased by 30% during the pandemic years. Canada issued stimulus checks which only fueled inflation. Suddenly, people started choosing unemployment and stimulus payments over going to work and having a salary, especially if they worked minimum wage jobs. Canada was facing a risk of recession, primarily fueled by labor shortages.
So the Canadian government thought, what if we brought more young people from the developing world who are eager and motivated to work? Foreign workers are less picky than Canadians and are willing to work minimum wage, they thought. Besides, we do need more tax dollars than ever to finance all the pensions, they thought.
Good idea! What if we financed our country through the big fat wallets of rich parents of international students? International students will bring a lot of cash and spend 5x more than domestic students on tuition fees. That's good tax revenue, they thought. In 2022, international students' spend was nearly $40 billion, contributing about $30 billion to the nation's GDP. Not bad, right?
So, the stream of foreign labor and international students more than doubled our official immigration numbers and targets by the end of 2023. Canada's crossed 40 million in population, which kind of an exciting thing for a country of this size and age. That's a 3% growth rate last year, the fastest rate since 1957.
From the government's standpoint, this was their way to avoid recession, boost the economy and fill up all the labor shortages we had. And it kind of worked. Canada did seemingly avoid recession. Labor shortages were seemingly filled. All good, right?
Not really. In 2024, Canada's productivity declined by 0.6%, marking the third consecutive year of decline. This downturn is concerning, especially when compared to the 0.8 average productivity growth among OECD countries during the same period.
Despite adding more workers to the economy, Canada's output per worker dropped. This suggests that while immigration helped fill jobs, it didn't address underlying issues such as underinvestment in technology, overinflated real estate, outdated infrastructure, and stagnant wages.
Immigration was a band-aid on the problem that Canada had way before the pandemic, but chose to ignore. With an increased immigration, the infrastructure started crumbling at a scary pace.
Busted water feeder main shutting down the Trans-Canada, the broken pipe, one of Calgary's main sources of water.
In a matter of minutes, parts of Toronto became unrecognizable.
And while the cause of these disasters is natural, it could have been avoided if there was adequate planning, maintenance, and engineering.
With an influx of people, rent and home prices started rising, reaching an all-time high, putting Canada in the list of countries with the most expensive real estate in the world. Immigrants who are used to poor living conditions resorted to living in unmaintained basements, sometimes with a dozen of roommates, completely ruining living conditions.
The healthcare system didn't even have a chance to recover from the brutal pandemic era, and it suddenly has to deal with not just the rapidly aging population, but an additional 1.5 million population. Young doctors already don't find working in Canada attractive, and many end up going to the US to practice, so doctors and nurse shortage led to long waiting times and staff burnout.
More demand for goods and services drove up prices for nearly anything in Canada. Canadian households are now the most indebted country in G7, mainly due to mortgage and consumer debt. That's right, Canadians owe more money than they earn.
The Canadian government pretty much opened the gates to let more migrants flow in the country. And when you open the gates and your filters are off, all sorts of stuff flows in. Uncontrolled immigration fueled a wave of scams and system abuse. You could come to Canada just by paying a couple of $1,000s under a temporary work permit program. Some refugee programs attracted opportunistic individuals who came to Canada only to collect their paychecks and go back to their country.
With the uncontrolled immigration and missing checks and balances, we saw an influx of broadly Asian population in Canada. When there is a sudden injection of a foreign culture in a country, it doesn't go unnoticed.
While each of us bring our rich cultures and languages and customs, it adds to the vibrant tapestry of Canadian society.
Successful cultural immersion requires a balance, where newcomers are encouraged to preserve their heritage while also respecting and embracing the Canadian culture and laws. However, when cultural integration happens too quickly or without adequate systems in place to support it, it leads to tensions and poop on the beach.
All this has led to a public outrage. People feel poor, unhappy, unhealthy, and just plain disregarded. Canadians report more and more that they feel that the government treats immigrants better than them. If you think of it, that's really bad. It leads to an even higher level of disengagement, productivity loss, and in the worst case, churn.
There's been a record amount of Canadians leaving the country in the recent years, looking for a lower cost of living and more desirable quality of life. Reports have shown that nearly 30% of newcomers are returning to their home country after just a few years.
In 2024, the public pressure and the crumbling infrastructure finally forced the government into tough decisions, and we'll share at the end our thoughts on whether we think it helps or makes things worse.
It's reducing permanent immigration levels by at least 20%.
Cutting temporary immigrant numbers by nearly 500,000 a year.
This is a huge about-face for the Liberal government.
They basically hit pause on the system for 3 years.
It's just unbelievable, dramatic.
2024 has seen some of the most radical immigration reforms at both federal and provincial levels, aiming to address economic challenges, housing shortages, and public concerns.
The federal government announced a 20% decrease in permanent resident admissions, adjusting targets and gradually reducing them over the next 3 years. That means that a big bulk of the additional 500 to 800,000 of foreign workers or international students who hope to eventually get permanent residence here won't get it.
Up until now, there have never been caps on temporary residence. So we have caps now for the first time. This includes international students and foreign workers. It's meant to manage population growth and alleviate pressure on housing and public services. That's nearly a 50% reduction compared to the recent years' numbers. Canada's temporary population will decrease over the next few years, as significantly more temporary residents will also transition to PR or will be forced to leave the country.
A 2-year intake cap on international student study permits was introduced, reducing the number of permits issued to 437,000 for 2025 and 2026. That's at least 300,000 less than last year. Postgraduate work permit eligibility, which used to be automatic no matter the program you study, is now tied to fields of study, aligned with Canada's labor market needs. Students who study degrees considered useless for the Canadian labor shortages may no longer be eligible for PGWPs. And starting November 1st, 2024, international students applying for PGWPs must meet specific language proficiency standards.
Effective November this year, the starting hourly wage for workers entering Canada through the high-wage stream was raised to 20% above the median wage in the applicable province or territory. This adjustment aims to ensure that the employment of temporary foreign workers does not suppress wages for Canadian workers. The government also reinstated a 10% cap on the proportion of low-wage temporary foreign workers that employers can hire, applicable across Canada. Exceptions are made for employers in healthcare, construction, and food processing sectors, where a 20% cap is permitted to address critical labor shortages. All LMIAs approved for low-wage positions are also now limited to a maximum duration of 1 year instead of 2.
Most provinces are now revisiting their own provincial nominee programs. Historically, a provincial nominee program was known to be an easiest and more accessible way to immigrate to Canada. Not anymore. Quebec has announced suspension of 2 permanent immigration programs, the regular skilled worker program and the graduate stream of the Quebec Experience program, effective until June 30th next year. All that to manage the province's capacity to integrate newcomers. At the same time, Francophone immigration will pick up, amounting for up to 10% of all temporary residents over the next 3 years. Ontario has paused some of its provincial programs like the Entrepreneur Stream, and BC established regional immigration quotas that are tied directly to the housing availability in the province.
These are some of the biggest immigration reforms seen in decades in Canada. Let us know if you've missed something important.
On one hand, this is great. The government has finally heard the cry for help and did something about it. This is good, and honestly, I don't think that they've had a choice if they want to stand at least the slightest chance in the upcoming elections.
But on the flip side, are these reforms going to substantially improve the Canadian economy or the life of Canadians? I'm not entirely sure. Let's take a look at the summary of pros and cons from the experts.
First point is that immigration reform will help address the infrastructure strain. The benefit here is that by reducing immigration, the government alleviates pressure on housing, healthcare, and other public services.
The drawback is that reducing overall immigration and temporary foreign worker numbers may exacerbate shortages in sectors like agriculture, healthcare, and construction. Immigration slows down, but growth in aging population does not. Neither does the need to improve our infrastructure and build new houses. Besides, we're already seeing an increase in asylum claims. That's one way to bypass immigration caps.
Personally, I tend to agree with the drawbacks more than with the benefits. Reducing immigration in isolation without doing additional reforms of how other systems function and grow will likely hinder economic progress. This should be a full combination of combined efforts. I think we should have a look into improving our infrastructure and build more housing. Now the question is, do we have enough labor or expertise to do that?
Or how about the outdated zoning laws and building permits that still take painfully long and expensive to expedite construction? The next point is immigration reform will help repair the damaged relationship between the government and the people. This one is the most obvious one. We live in a democratic society, and it is expected by the people that the government does what the majority wants, and if it doesn't, people get angry. The benefit of this is that by reducing immigration, the government aligns with the majority of the Canadian sentiment in hopes to improve the public trust in the said government.
However, some critics say that this is a short-sighted decision meant to do nothing but to elevate the already failing ratings of the current government in power. Again, let's look at why our immigration skyrocketed, which is economic stimulus and filling labor shortages.
Reducing immigration will just unmask underlying economic and labor issues, since immigration accounts for nearly 100% of the country's labor force growth.
We need a plan on how to tackle our fundamental economic weaknesses along with the immigration reform. Don't forget the point about how low productivity of Canadian labor is and poor technological development. Cutting immigration numbers will not fix that.
And honestly, sometimes the role of the government is to make unpopular decisions. Let's be real, most of us lack the education, the knowledge, and the foresight of what effect some of our desires and wishes will have for the years to come. So personally, I think that the government is blindly trying to please the population, and it's ignoring the after effect, which is likely going to be up to the new government to solve if liberals don't get re-elected. I'm thinking about it as a trap that the current government is setting up for the future government to deal with.
Next, international student reform will optimize quality over quantity. Linking international student work permits and post-graduation eligibility to in-demand fields ensures that the labor market benefits from targeted skills.
On the flip side, colleges and universities will face budget deficits and job cuts.
Let's be real, most international students come to Canada in hopes to get Canadian permanent residency. That is why it's been rather popular among students to find the cheapest and the easiest program in Canada, get your study permit and eventually work towards qualifying for PR. The immigration path from student to PR is often easier than the path from skilled foreigner to PR, provided you have the money, of course. So this reform is meant to improve the quality of international students and make sure that what they study is aligned with our labor market needs.
Honestly, I don't really see any drawbacks to this specific reform. I'm just surprised that it hasn't been done earlier. I also think it's a good thing that they're forcing language assessment to qualify for PGWP. I know that this decision has faced a lot of backlash from the international student community. But I think overall this thing is good, and this is why. When I went to university, I had a handful of international students in my class, and I almost always had at least one international student in my project group. And you know what was the most frustrating thing? Most could barely speak or understand English, even though they were second or even third-year students. So many of them were just a dead weight on the project because they just weren't helpful. So as someone who've experienced working with students with poor English, I personally fully support the language requirements to qualify for PGWP.
Well, it makes sense, because if your English sucks, how can you even pass a job interview, let alone be a productive worker?
The new rules also refocus immigration to encourage regional growth. The benefit here is that new reforms focus on spreading immigration to underrepresented regions to prevent overcrowding in urban centers, which will fuel more economic development and hopefully elevate region desirability.
However, some may argue that there is a reason why people don't go to less populated regions, specifically due to lack of work opportunities, adequate support, resources, and infrastructure. It may be hard for newcomers to integrate into smaller communities that are known to be more tight and sometimes less accepting for foreigners.
I think attracting more people to less popular regions is great. We've been long saying that on this channel. There are so many hidden gems all around Canada outside of the rundown top 5 cities. We will link a playlist of some of the great affordable cities up here.
Cost of living is a lot more reasonable there, and opportunities can still be plenty if you are in the in-demand field or are planning to build your own business. Next, temporary foreign worker program limitations will help fight fraud and wage suppression.
Reforms to the temporary foreign worker program can curb exploitative practices by unscrupulous employers and consultants. Caps on low-wage streams address over-reliance on cheap labor and wage suppression. This encourages employers to invest in training local workers and adopt long-term and sustainable hiring practices.
However, while these reforms address fraud and wage issues, they could inadvertently reduce access to foreign labor in sectors that rely heavily on temporary foreign workers, such as agriculture, food processing, and caregiving. Some businesses say that they can only survive thanks to the availability of cheap labor. Reducing access to it will hurt many small businesses.
I personally think that it's a net positive. More oversight for the program is better to reduce abuse.
Now, let's not expect that abuse disappears. There will will always be bad actors, and for every rule there will always be someone who wants to break it. So the question is, how well will this program be monitored and controlled?
I do empathize with the small businesses who may lose money by losing cheap labor, but I look at it as a way to force these businesses into investing into technology, efficiency, and better training. You can't always rely on cheap labor. That just doesn't make a business successful.
This was a brief overview of the immigration policies and potential effects of it. We are immigrants ourselves, and generally I think that uncontrolled immigration of the last few years is unacceptable. It's simply unfair to most skilled immigrants who worked really hard for years just to get to and succeed in Canada.
It also undermines the overall perception of the well-intended immigrants, those immigrants who are sincerely here to assimilate and make a difference in this country.
In the last years, immigration to Canada has become way too easy, attracting a lot of low-commitment individuals who have no interest in building their life here or integrating into society. Most are here just to milk Canada and send money back home, or use it as a stepping stone to get to the US. That's not acceptable.
We would like to see Canada become pickier about who it lets in, and maybe some deportations are due as well. We also think that Canada should be stricter about newcomers, students, or temporary workers who break the law. You break the law, you're out. There is never a shortage of bad actors. There is a shortage of good, hardworking people.
Immigration should not be easy. It's a difficult process physically and mentally. It's like a litmus test. In my experience, immigrants who've worked the hardest to come and stay here are also folks who have succeeded the most and added the most value to the Canadian economy by either starting a successful business, helping other newcomers succeed, or achieving top positions in Canada's largest companies. When you come to the country and expect everything be brought to you on a silver plate, everything from good medicine to job opportunities and social benefits, all while you don't even bother learning the language or understanding the local norms, I don't think you deserve to be here.
Look, Canada was built on immigration. And from the business standpoint, we understand the role of low skill and low wage in the growth of the economy. However, over-reliance on immigration has slightly ruined Canada.
It made Canada complacent.
Complacency is the biggest epidemic in this country. By beefing up economic numbers through bringing in immigrant cash here, Canada got lazy. It's like easy money, like a drug. Numbers were up, people didn't complain, all good, right? That allowed the government to sit back and do their minimum. It allowed Canadian workers to sit back and relax while letting immigrants work hard and spin their wheels.
This led to massive productivity drops. Productivity didn't plummet just in the last few years. It was dropping since early 2000s. The last 5 years have just made it a lot more obvious. We have reached the tipping point.
Canada historically underinvested into technology, research and development, training and upskilling.
It overinvested in immigrant labor, the easiest and cheapest way to boost economic growth.
Now, Canada looks like a first world country, but do we operate like one?
Time will tell, but I have faith in Canada.
Let us know your thoughts on this. We tried to cram a lot of information in this video, so we probably missed a thing or two. So let us know what we've missed and your thoughts on this topic.
Thank you for watching. Share this video with your friends and happy holidays.
Take care.